Hello, and welcome to the Evidence-Based Exercise Rehabilitation and Sport Performance channel. This channel is for the healthcare movement professional looking to incorporate applied research concepts into their current practice setting. Today's topic, comparisons of using a dynamic warm-up versus a motor control warm-up. The objectives of this discussion are to determine the degree to which a dynamic warm-up protocol and a motor control warm-up protocol can increase passive range of motion, and provide a means by which you can utilize reported confidence intervals and effect sizes to enhance your clinical outcomes. Today we'll be highlighting reported outcomes by Gamma et al. That explain dynamic versus motor control warm-up strategies and their effects on passive range of motion. Please note, I do not have any financial or other associations with the total motion release group. There's no commercial support provided for the activities performed during this discussion, nor am I receiving a fee. Additionally, I have not undergone any of their coursework. In accordance with the Oxford Center for Evidence-Based Medicine, this is a randomized crossover design study and falls under the category of Level 2 evidence. So let's have a look at what the authors did in this study. So this table summarizes things here for us. So it was performed in 2018, so it's fairly recent. The authors looked at 20 male baseball athletes between the age ranges of 15 and 22 years old. Of the 2015 were collegiate and 5 were high school, and of the 2017 of them were right arm dominant throwers, and then the other 3 were left arm dominant throwers. The dependent variable, or the variable that was being measured, is passive supine glenohumeral internal-external range of motion. The authors utilized 2 strategies to see what kind of effect that they would have on the passive supine range of motion. So individuals were broken up into 2 groups, 10 in each group. We had a motor control group, or as it's referred to in the title of the article and the article itself, total motion release. And then we had a dynamic warm-up group. Group 1 consisted of 10 individuals performing the dynamic warm-up first, and then it was followed up with a total motion release warm-up. Group 2 performed the total motion release warm-up first, and then that was followed up by the dynamic warm-up. Let's jump over to sets and reps here. I am not going to go through each of the exercises in the dynamic warm-up. Those are pretty self-explanatory. You will notice that they are full body, and some are shoulder specific as well too. If we go on to the last 3, we have standing arm circles, standing 90-90, IR-ER with tubing, and then the sideline sleeper stretch as well. The total motion release, the individuals did 2 primary movements. So they did standing trunk twists, and then they did standing arm raises. I'll have pictures of these on the next slide here, but a basic description here is standing trunk twist. The individual is going to be leaning forward, and then the authors had them twist right and twist left. Whichever side was easier and they had more motion toward, that was the side that the individuals performed the sets and reps on. Same thing with the standing arm raise or shoulder flexion that was performed. The authors looked at what side was easier and had more motion, and that was the side that the 3 sets of 30-second holds were performed on. And breathing was performed with that as well too. So they have the individual get as far into the ROM as they could, hold it, and then take a deep breath, and on the exhale, try to move further until a new barrier was hit, and then they'd hang out at that barrier, breathe again, and on each breath, continuously try to get further and further. The rest between sets for the TMR was 30 seconds. With the dynamic warm-up, there was no rest. The duration took approximately 8 to 10 minutes to complete the TMR protocol versus the dynamic warm-up took 15 to 20 minutes. The intensity here, I purposefully went through last. We only have specific intensities reported for the sprinting efforts in the dynamic warm-up. all the rest of it is pretty subjective. So you're looking at this is based on the individual, how hard they actually went during the dynamic warm-up, and the total motion release warm-up is really based on an individual basis, if you will. So let's take a look at the results of this study. It's important for me to say, because I didn't say it on the previous slide where I was going through the data extraction, that the measurements were all taken on the dominant arm, the throwing arm of these baseball athletes. So we'll begin with shoulder internal rotation. So the first measure that we looked at here, we looked at the time points. Now the time points, we had both groups. They were either doing the dynamic warm-up first or the total motion release first. So the first would be our first intervention or our first time point. So group 1 did the dynamic warm-up first, and group 2 did the total motion release first. You can see our mean changes in increase in shoulder internal rotation. So for the dynamic warm-up, we had a average increase on internal rotation of 6.2 plus or minus 10 degrees. For the TMR, we had an average increase of 18.2 plus or minus 5.3. The p-value was less than 0.05. It's 0.005 is what it was reported at, so that tells us that mathematically the two groups are different for that time point. The second time point was the second intervention that both groups underwent, which we essentially flip-flopped them here because it was a crossover study. So group 1 for the second intervention performed the TMR, which they received a 17.1% on average increase plus or minus 6 degrees. And then the dynamic warm-up group, which was group 2, actually lost motion. They lost 5.4 degrees plus or minus 9.6 degrees. So the difference between the time point 1 and the time point 2 with each group was statistically significant. For this second time point, it was 0.001, that's less than 0.05, again telling us that both groups are mathematically different. Now, to determine how different they actually were and what we can use clinically, we're going to go to the next slide and we're going to look at the 95% confidence interval and the effect size. Now let's have a look at things here clinically. We found that at time point 1 that there was a mathematical difference between the two groups. Now let's look at how big that difference is. So the effect size calculated for that difference was 1.5, and that's verbalized as a very large effect size, which means that roughly the distributions of the two groups overlap roughly about 29%, or 29% of the time we could expect the same results between the two interventions. The 95% confidence interval range tells us that if we were to apply this to the population at large, that we could expect a difference between the two protocols that falls anywhere between 4.2 and 19.8 degrees in terms of increased shoulder range of motion. For time point 2, also a mathematical difference. Our Cohen's D effect size was at 3.08. This is extremely large. This is off the charts large, telling us that there's no overlap between the two protocols. The 95% confidence interval range tells us that if we were going to apply this to the population at large, we could anticipate the difference between the two would fall anywhere between 15 and 29 degrees of internal rotation. Let's real quickly go back to the effect size. Since that is so large, what we would typically want to do is make sure that there's other research that replicates what was done here to see what their effect size was as well too. There are a lot of things that can lead to a high effect size, so we would just want to have some other research to verify that number. It is a very good number, but we just want to keep in mind that it's almost too good. So we need some additional information to just verify and back that up. Now let's have a look at what was found for shoulder external rotation. For time point 1, group 1, receiving the dynamic warm-up first, received an increase in external rotation of 3.5 degrees plus or minus 7 degrees. Group 2, their first intervention was TMR, and they received a 10.5 degree increase on average, plus or minus 4 degrees. The difference between these increases was found to be statistically significant. P was less than 0.05. Looking at the second intervention that was performed, Group 1 performed the total motion release and saw a gain in external rotation of 11.4 degrees plus or minus 6 degrees. Group 2 performed the dynamic warm-up and lost on average 4.1 degree of external rotation plus or minus 6.52 degrees. The difference between these two were found to be statistically significant, and the p-value was calculated at 0.001. Let's go to the next slide and take a look at what this all means from a clinical standpoint. Now let's have a look at our clinical applications here. So we notice that at time point 1, there was a mathematical difference between the two groups. So looking at the 95% CI range and effect size range can give us an idea of the magnitude of that difference. So the effect size, first of all, fell at 1.2, which tells us there is roughly about a 38% overlap in terms of the results that you could get between the two protocols. The 95% confidence interval range tells us that if we were to apply this to the population at large, general population at large, who share the same demographics, we could expect a difference between the two groups that falls anywhere between 1.3 and 12.6 degrees of external rotation. For time point 2, again, mathematically, there's a difference between the two groups. Looking at the effect size, we have a very large effect size. It falls at 2.5, which tells us there's very little to no overlap between the protocols. And the 95% confidence interval range falls between a difference between the groups of 9.5 degrees and 21.5 degrees if we were to apply it to the population at large with the same demographic. Lastly, let's have a look at the order effects that these two different protocols can have when we're stacking one on top of the other. For group 1, the change between the baseline and the completion of the dynamic warm-up resulted in a 6.2 degree change of internal rotation. This was not found to be statistically significant. If we take and we complete the dynamic warm-up and then perform the TMR warm-up following that, it was found that an increase in 17 degrees plus or minus 6 degrees took place in increasing internal rotation at the shoulder. This was found to be statistically significant. When we look at external rotation in group 1, again, between baseline and the conclusion of the dynamic warm-up, a 3 degree plus or minus 7 degrees was found in external rotation. This difference was not found to be statistically significant. If we take the dynamic warm-up and we follow it up with a total motion release warm-up, an increase in external rotation was found to have taken place, 11 degrees plus or minus 6 degrees, and this was a statistically significant increase. For group 2, they began with the baseline comparison to the completion of the total motion release and found that internal rotation increased by 18 degrees plus or minus 5 degrees. This is a statistically significant change. If upon the completion of total motion release, it was followed up with the dynamic warm-up for internal rotation, an actual 5 degree loss was observed, plus or minus 9 degrees. For external rotation, they began with total motion release between baseline and the conclusion of that protocol and found that an increase in external rotation of 10 degrees plus or minus 4 degrees took place. When that was followed up by the dynamic warm-up, a loss of 4 degrees took place plus or minus 6 degrees. So we're seeing that when you start with total motion release and you follow it up with a dynamic warm-up protocol, you're losing some of the gain that took place during that total motion release. Now, whether that's due to the limitation of the amount of time that the body sustains the total motion release, or it's due to the dynamic warm-up itself, has yet to be said. So clinically, what does that all mean? A few things here. So in taking a look at what was actually reported for the order effects, all we have are mean changes and p-values. That's great. It's a good start, but it doesn't provide us two things. It doesn't provide us a confidence interval range that would allow us to anticipate what we could expect if applied to the greater population with the same demographic. It also does not allow us an effect size telling us how much the treatments would actually overlap from one another in terms of their ability to produce a particular effect. Ah, yeah, once again, it's time for Clinical Gems! Yay, yay! All right. So, what clinical gems are we walking away with today? Let's have a look at the evidence-based truths this article provides. First, movement prep utilizes the nervous system and can increase passive range of motion. Second, motor control warm-up strategies can result in less time on task and clinically significant improvements in motor task outcomes. And lastly, when applying both motor control and generic dynamic warm-up routine, greater levels of range of motion are maintained if motor control work is performed following a dynamic warm-up. Additionally, authors of this study observed a greater IR to ER ratio following the TMR treatments. So what types of strategies can we use to apply these new truths to the body? First of all, have an understanding of what your warm-up will provide. It should help you reach a greater goal that you have set for your patient or athlete. Remember, a warm-up is not composed of a single item. Every item within a warm-up can potentially affect another. For example, what will removing stability and feedback do to the task of walking? Two implementation strategies that the authors utilized in this particular study involve the use of interlimb coupling and cross-transfer exercise. If you're not familiar with those terms, please visit our channel and I have separate videos made up on each one of them. Make sure that your warm-up is setting appropriate. Is the warm-up supposed to be designed for a rehabilitative session, a high endurance session, a high power session, a strengthening session? And lastly, make sure the effort level of the individual is setting appropriate as well too. Is the warm-up being performed to the degree in which it can help you get the particular results you want? Effort plays into this. Now lastly, a quick moment of reflection here. You got to make sure that you're having an understanding of what these new truths can and cannot give you. We've gone through that pretty thoroughly in this video. So make sure that you're just not randomly applying this to any of your clients or patients. Have a reason for doing it. Design with a purpose. In order to determine how effective utilizing this is for the individuals that we're working with, you need to have some kind of measurable outcome that helps you assess your clinical effectiveness. And then lastly, how is all this programming going to help you and your patient work towards the greater goals that you have designed for them? Here at the channel, we're dedicated to establish and foster a positive interprofessional environment in which learning can occur regardless of your profession and or previous training. Please help us spread the word to your healthcare movement colleagues looking to incorporate more evidence-based research application into their own practice. As always, if you like what you see, please subscribe and join our YouTube channel community, where the number one goal is improving the lives of those we serve. A big thanks for hanging out with us today. See you in the next video.